All right, everybody. This is the long-awaited lecture with an overview into personal autonomy. We generally make it synonymous with self-determination, right? The ability for the person to make their own choices for themselves, for better or worse. Remember, autonomy means self, auto means self, and nomos means laws or norms. So it's basically like self-lawmaking or self-governing. And we looked at Kant's idea of acting autonomously, which was a very unique flavor, right? It was you acted autonomously and independently if it conformed with the categorical imperative. This is a much broader, more workable definition of autonomy, which then you can see how informed consent, things like decision-making capacity, fall underneath the umbrella of autonomy. So here you can see autonomy, basically the ability to make free choices as a self-determining individual. And we've already kind of gone at like why we value autonomy, right? Why do we not take the pleasure door, and why do we take the real door instead? But it's worth thinking about how are we different than like animals in our autonomy? Don't animals make choices of whether to obey or to disobey, or to like, go to the door if they need to go out or to poop on the couch, right? And don't children make choices, right? Yet we don't think that they have full autonomy, right? So what are these gradations? Clearly, children make some choices, yeah. They choose what shirt to wear, whether to say please or thank you, but we don't hold them fully responsible for those choices. And likewise, if people are, they do something like commit a crime in the heat of anger, right, in a fit of passion, we judge them morally differently than if it was premeditated and they'd clocked it all the way through and planned it while they were calm, right? Um, and so it's interesting to think about in what ways, at what levels are these things acting autonomously. And so this is kind of a framework just to help us understand that. So the most basic level, someone's acting autonomously if they act independently, right? Independent, a person must be capable of making his or her own free choices without the control of any external constraint or inner compulsion. So children usually meet the independence criteria, right? They choose to play this game or to not, to try hard or to not, to pull the girl's hair, to write their name on the top of the line, or to not, right? But they don't really think those decisions through, compare alternatives off. They're very impulsive, right? Um, there are a number of constraints, which we're going to talk more about next week with why doctors intervene, that hinder even the independence criteria, let alone the competency or the authenticity criteria, such as if you're hypnotized, right? You're not responsible for what you choose to do. If you're threatened or forced, if someone's got a gun to your head and says like, you know, do this bad thing, or I'm gonna like hurt you or your family. Well, when you do that thing, you're not really independently choosing that, right? It's under great constraints and force. And likewise, inner constraints are, I mean, neuroses, OCD, addiction, phobias, emotional, physical pain, right? You're not really responsible for things if you're afraid of not, if you have an irrational fear of something while you're reacting, right? Or it's just a impulsive thing coming out of you. So that's the base level of autonomy, is meeting the independence criteria. Now, somewhere along the way, children become teenagers, and this is the slippery slope, right? Like we all recognize there's a meaningful distinction between the responsibility we give to adults, and how we don't give it to children. But you can't point to a day, right, where a child becomes a grown up. It's this weird scale, right? So how do we know that they can meet this thing? Well, like somewhere in the teens, kids and teens start to be able to compare alternative outcomes, right? And so the competency condition is a person must be capable of rationally deliberating about his or her choices. And I shouldn't say just teens, young, I know kids under 10 who can do this too, but like to integrate it and do it all the time, right? Capable of knowing and understanding, one, what choices are available, the consequences of those choices, and how well these choices correlate with our own goals and values. Remember, the whole argument for paternalism was you're justified in invoking paternalism like with the person stepping onto the wrong train or into traffic, because you know they're directly acting against their own long-term goals and values, right? Um, and so the competency is, and this goes into decision-making capacity, be able to hear and understand what the options are, what the alternatives and consequences of one option or another are, and to see which of those fit with your own long-term goals and values, right? The third is the authenticity requirement, and this is the trickiest and most elusive and a very high standard. I think most of us would generally think that someone who met the first two criteria, the independence and the competency conditions, would be acting autonomously, and they might. But the third criteria says that not only must a person be able to act independently and competently, but authentically, which means that they must be capable of discerning, reflecting upon, and personally choosing his or her own goals and values, right? Must be capable of making choices about values themselves versus living up to a parent's values or making them your own, right? And so the classic example of somebody who has grown up in a very strict religion. Oh, don't even tell me this is. Okay, so in this instance, what is going on here? In this instance, let's say you have a person who becomes a doctor, and another person becomes a doctor. One person becomes a doctor not because they really want to, but because they want to keep their parents happy, or they don't know what else to do after their undergrad, right? You surprised the number of people I know fall in this category. And they go through med school and the residency, and they make it work, right? La da 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 da. But it's not really meaningful. They don't like the stress. They hate the sight of blood, et cetera, et cetera. Something absurd, right? Versus someone who becomes a doctor because they really want to help people, to serve. They find it fascinating. It's meaningful. They like the authority and the delegation and the high stress, and they're adrenaline junkies or whatever, right? Falls all over the place. One of them is just doing what their parents want, right? And they think that they're living up to it. Same with a religion, right? And it's hard to say whether they're choosing that because it's their value or it's their parents' value on the cave that they grew up in, and they just inherited it because they want to be a good kid and then a good person, right? And so they assimilated it, right? Versus someone who's like raised religious, decides that religion's bullshit in their teens because all teenagers know what's right. Go off, samples, maybe all the world religions. They become a Buddhist because they want to be new age and hip, right? Uh, present company excluded. No, I definitely went that way. And then bounced around to all, Hinduism, Taoism, study the Eastern stuff, right? All the good things. And eventually, and maybe even become an atheist or an agnostic along the way, and eventually like find themselves coming back to the religion that they grew up in and maybe like become a Christian again. Like I have a number of aunts and uncles who did something similar. Well, the argument runs they meet the authenticity condition when they go to church now better than the person who was just raised, a good Christian by their parents and stayed a good Christian and did everything right. Right? The prodigal son who comes back for those Christians, use the parable. The prodigal son who comes back, is just brought in versus the person who just did the thing right the whole time is not rewarded the same way the lost sheep is, right? And so it's worth thinking about whether or not your own long-term goals and values, whatever, are really yours or that you inherited them from, the walls of your cave, as I would like to say. And so, okay, real quickly, you can skim through this, a couple examples to really play it out. The 8-year-old who's rushed into an ER with emergency bleeding, right? It's in an area, it's under the skirt. It's a girl. They don't know if it's emergency bleeding. She refuses. She's like, no, no. They try calling parents to get a hold of her. Can't get a hold of parents. She doesn't want them to treat her. She's a young female. They override her and treat her because they don't consider her autonomous. What does the 8-year-old child fail in the autonomy hierarchy? Secondly, you have an Alzheimer's patient who attacks the nurse who comes in to treat her every day with lunch, and violently, hurts her. we don't think she's autonomous, right? We don't give her moral agency, right? Or give her moral deference, or respect her rights, because she has constraints to her autonomy. Now, what are those constraints? Infant, comatose, persistent vegetative state. One example I really like is using the, let's say you're late for work and you have two choices. You can be late for work and make a good meal for yourself, right? And grab, like a sumptuous, meet all your dietary needs. Or you can grab an apple and a banana and a bagel on the way out the door, right? Apple and bagel. And you can be to work on time, you meet your dietary needs, but it's not that glamorous. Or you can stop at McDonald's on the way, you'll be to work on time, but it's not good for your diet, right? And so we have two long-term goals and values. We want to have a good diet and be to work on time, keep our career going strong, right? So what is the autonomous action here? You might decide to stay home and make a big breakfast for yourself, but you're only acting consistent with one of your long-term goals, right? The other one, to keep up with your career, if you're late for your job, that doesn't look good, right? You can explain it away, but it just doesn't look good. Or if you stop at McDonald's, you make it to work on time, but are you really going to say that eating McDonald's for breakfast is a good way to start your day? And so the bagel and the apple is the only thing which consistently meets your own long-term goals and values and, you know, works out, even though it's less glamorous. Yeah, examples down here. Joan, becomes a teacher, thinks she wants to be a teacher, and then quickly realizes that she hates teaching. I know several friends who went through all of school to become a teacher, and then after the practicums were like, I hate, no way, this is crazy. You'd be insane to do this. So they chose these careers, these majors, these paths, thinking that was what they wanted. They compared options, they chose it, but it was inconsistent with their own long-term preferences. They didn't know what those preferences were. Yeah, you got self-knowledge, right? This is the great game. You got Jerry, who thinks he wants to be a businessman, high-power suit wearing, but Jerry goes into business, decides realizes he suffers under deadlines. Horrible choice, right? So we might say they're acting autonomously, but like, are you really acting authentically? Okay, so a couple questions, yada da 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 da. That's basically all I wanted us to go over, but I will put this up and see you soon. All right.